Hi everyone. Thanks so much for joining. We'll give it one more minute and then we'll get started with today's webinar. Okay, great. I think we'll start there. Thank you everyone for joining today's VoxDevLit launch event. I'm Oliver Hannay. I'm the managing editor here at VoxDev, and I'll be hosting today's event to celebrate the release of our new VoxDevLit on land transport infrastructure. I'm delighted to welcome Marco Gonzalez-Navarro and Roman David Zarate, who are the senior editors of this VoxDevLit. The structure of today's session will be that the two senior editors will present for approximately 35 to 40 minutes before we open up for questions. You're able to ask questions or vote on other people's questions using the Q&A tab, and I'll be monitoring these and then pose them to Marco and Roman at the end of the session. So that's enough from me. I'll hand over now. Thanks again.
Thank you so much, Oliver, for organizing all of this. It's been a pleasure putting this together with Roman, who's here with us today too. And I want to say thanks to our co-editors, Remy Jedwab and Nick Ivanides for going over all of this and making very useful suggestions. And thanks to the VoxDev editors who suggested that we put this together. So it's about giving an overview of what's been going on in the literature on land transport infrastructure in developing countries. And we do feel that that was something that was missing. So we hope this is a very useful document for all of you. And it's going to be updated in the future as things come online. But for now, this gives, hopefully will give you a useful overview of the state of the literature today. All right, so the first thing to mention is that land transportation investments in developing countries are a pretty big deal. They are a large part of budgets. So to give you an example, national governments can spend up to 10% of their GDP on infrastructure investments, and down to very low levels. So there's huge variance on that. And for example, when we look at international organizations such as the World Bank, you see that about 10% of their total lending is geared towards infrastructure investments, $33 billion in their portfolio. So this is important, and it merits researchers to ask what is the role of infrastructure in developing countries. And here, broadly, the purpose of this is to facilitate market integration, to move goods around, to move people around, and to develop different regions of countries. So the second point is to enhance long-term productivity, to basically open up growth sectors to the world economy so they can produce what they're good at, and to improve competitiveness of local actors in global markets. So it's important. Those are the broad purposes and of infrastructure anywhere. But in this review, what we're going to be doing is first reviewing what is the landscape of infrastructure in developing countries. So how does it compare to developed, where most of the literature has focused? So what do we know about quantities, quality of infrastructure, and issues that are particular to developing countries in infrastructure? So that's the first part of the lit review. The second is that what has been a challenge in infrastructure is to evaluate rigorously what are the gains from these investments. So that's not an easy thing to do, and we'll review what are the frameworks that have been developed in the literature to answer these questions. And then the last part of the document is about just overviewing the main results and trying to piece them together. What do they tend to say? What are the main findings? Where do we see more open questions that we have yet to answer? Although there's been a lot of growth and we're excited to put this together, there are still a lot of open questions, and we'll mention them throughout as we progress in this presentation, and you'll see that same thing going on in the document. Okay, so first, let's discuss the landscape of infrastructure in developing countries. So one thing that is clear from a lot of papers is that land transportation in developing countries tends to be more expensive than in developed countries. So to give you some statistics, in this paper by Osborne, Pachon, and Araya, they document that road transport costs per ton kilometer are about 17 cents of a dollar in Central America versus you can compare that to 2 cents per dollar, 2 cents per kilometer ton in the US, so much higher in this region. Another influential paper by Atkin and Donaldson finds that the trade costs, or the cost of goods, rise about 4 to 5 times faster in Africa than in the US. So use comparable methods, comparable data, and they also find evidence of much higher effects of distance on cost of goods, suggesting that the cost of moving things around in Africa is 4 to 5 times higher than in the US. And similarly, a paper by Porteous finds that median trade costs in Africa are about 5 times those in the rest of the world. So broadly, there are sufficient papers out there to convince us that transport costs tends to be higher in developing than in developed countries. And then so once that is established, the next question is, why are there higher costs of transportation in developing countries? The first thing we're going to see is that from the data in a couple of slides is that developing countries tend to have much less infrastructure than developed countries. And furthermore, we're going to see that other measures, not just having a road or a railroad track, it's different, but also the quality of these infrastructures are quite different. So this impacts on things like reliability, which, as we'll see, has been shown to have effects on firms and productivity of firms. The other reason transport costs can be high might not be solely due to the quality of or the quantity of infrastructure, but other issues such as the industrial organization of the sectors that transport goods and people in developing countries. So we're thinking of market power of operators and intermediaries might be lower. And this is kind of a very new research field. So there are only a few papers, but it is something where there is growing interest in determining to what extent these high transport costs are due to lack of competition in the transportation sector. And finally, we're going to discuss the evidence on how much of these high costs of transportation are due to expensive or ineffective procurement. So there's been some literature there too. So let me start with quantity. So we put together these numbers to compare the abundance or lack of infrastructure in developed versus developing countries. So this is data from Meijer et al. That was compiled by Lucy Hackett, who assisted us with this document. And it's normalized by either population on the left-hand side. And in the document, you'll see one by area too. And what you see is that here, let me point this with my cursor. Here, for high-income countries, you tend to see much higher levels of roads per capita than in lower-income countries. So here you go from about 7,000 kilometers per million people of roads to, this is about a fourth of what you see in developed countries, right? So it varies between upper middle is a bit more, low income is low, and also lower middle income. You can see the distribution by region on the right-hand side, and you can see, the much lower levels of infrastructure in terms of roads per capita in Africa, South Asia, East Asia Pacific, and the Middle East countries. So basically what we want you to take away from this is that the quantity of infrastructure is much lower in developing countries versus developed ones. So that's a big difference. Here's a map from the World Bank where you can see this graphically. And so you wouldn't be surprised to know that Europe, Japan, the US have a high density of roads, and the quality of those roads tend to be high. If you notice, it's dominated by these dark red, which are highways. Whereas if you turn your eyes to the poorer parts of the world, you see that, for example, in Africa, roads tend to be dominated by tertiary roads or local roads, and you see very few miles of highways in these countries. You can see here China, huge growth in infrastructure, which has been the story of the last 2 or 3 decades. And so you do see this correlation between wealthy countries having more infrastructure and poorer countries having less road infrastructure. Here's a similar graph from the World Bank, looking at kilometers. These are railroads, major railroads in different parts of the world. And you can see, again, high density in Europe, North America, and less density in the developing countries. Although an exception is a pretty reasonable density in India, and we'll see a paper discussing that, studying that infrastructure. Finally, in terms of motivation, here we're gonna also in the lit review. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me go back here. Yes. So in the lit review, we also discuss the effects of infrastructure within cities. So not only across regions or across cities, but we also look at the effects of infrastructure in cities. So we look at subways, urban roads, BRTs, etc. And in this, we can discuss the following figure from the recent paper by Protoy Akbar and co-authors. So one big issue in developing countries related to infrastructure is the effects of congestion. So there's been, some very interesting advances there. So here's from a paper that compares congestion across rich and poor countries. And what you can see is that congestion basically, on the x-axis, we have income, and on the y-axis, we have a measure of congestion. And what you can see is congestion doesn't seem to change very much with income overall. So most of the world has, you can think of as similar levels of congestion, not drastically different. But what is different is that as incomes grow, countries tend to see higher speeds of mobility. So you can see here on the lower left-hand side, for measures of speed, you can see that as incomes grow, people tend to move around at faster speeds and at greater distances. And one interesting fact that we're going to discuss is that much of that variation in speed across income levels is going to be due not to congestion, but rather to uncongested speed. So what this will point to is the importance of infrastructure to move people around, and the lesser importance of congestion at reducing speeds. And so we'll be discussing that too. So I hope I've convinced you that quantity of infrastructure is much lower in developing countries. And the other big difference between developed and developing countries that we discuss in the first part of the lit review is the quality of infrastructure. So we find lower rates of road paving, as you could have seen in that world map that I showed on roads. And there's recent data, and I put here the links to the papers, and you'll have them also in the lit review, is that this uncertainty in travel time due to lower quality has been shown to have negative effects on firms who need to hold higher inventories to keep operating when there are delays. Other papers like Kusar and Namir show that low capacity of roads also tends to reduce the amount of trade. And so they look at how upgrading to expressways leads to pretty dramatic increases in the trade across locations. And so that you can think of as a quality improvement. One thing that's specific to roads in developing countries and to transportation in general, that's more specific to these regions, is the issues of crime and corruption. So there's the paper by Olken and Pandey documenting how a substantial proportion of the cost of transportation are just paying bribes at different locations. And crime, you can think of that too as loss of merchandise while in transport, and that also obviously leads to higher costs, right? For consumers. So let me briefly mention what we found in the literature regarding the importance of procurement of infrastructure and placement. So as you know, one of the features of infrastructure is their durability. So once you build them, they stay there for many years or decades. And so deciding where to put the infrastructure is a key issue in developing countries. And we've noticed pretty, from the limited number of papers that have looked into this, pretty dramatic failures of governance there. So you do need strong institutions to decide adequately where to put these infrastructures and how to procure them so that you reduce corruption. So some of the papers that have discussed corruption are Chen, working paper looking at corruption in China and during procurement, or the paper by Collier and co-authors here, this showing how even for World Bank projects, places where there's higher levels of corruption and civil unrest, the cost of construction tend to be higher. So those are also drivers of high infrastructure costs. And then the same literature also discusses things that countries can do to improve these issues. So one is the paper by Olken discussing how audits reduce corruption in road building in Indonesia, or the paper by Luis Fopel et al. Looking at the effects, the positive effects of e-procurement for lowering cost and increasing quality of infrastructure. So let me just end mentioning I hope, maybe I'm taking too long, right? So I'll try to go a little bit faster. There's a literature discussing the issues of inefficient placement. So a fantastic paper looking at ethnic favoritism in Africa. And so this paper by Burgess et al. Discusses how during autocratic periods in Kenya, the ethnicity of the president really predicts where roads are going to get built. So in districts that share co-ethnic status with the president. And as a corollary, during democracies, even when the president is still the same person, you do see less, a much lower extent of this type of ethnic favoritism. Other recent papers, for example, this one in Colombia, looking at how road infrastructure is used to buy votes in the legislative decision-making in rural areas. So again, suggesting that roads are not efficiently placed. So all of this is fascinating work. Let me see here the chat. Okay, so finally, in terms of a big issue we discussed and we found is that there's a pretty big gap and there's need for more work in this literature on how to finance infrastructure. So here, two big things have been discussed. One is PPP, so public-private partnerships, were a few, a decade or 2 decades ago suggested as a way of increasing infrastructure investment in developing countries. And now, we can look back and see how well those worked. So one thing that is evident is that they didn't become very relevant. So it's pretty limited amounts. And second, that the issues that we saw with government procurement for infrastructure kind of carry over to PPP. So governments tend to lack the know-how to write contracts that work well for them, and so you tend to see a lot of cost overruns even when using PPP. So you can see these papers here, and they kind of are a word of caution against. They haven't been so successful. There's been increasing attention in some examples. So this is to be developed in the future on land value capture model. So there are examples from the developing world on how to use the increases that come from land values as a result of infrastructure construction to kind of pay off offset some of the costs. So those are pretty exciting work. And you can see the book by Suzuki et al. On those examples. And finally, I will say Roman is going to talk about the methods before we go on to what the results are, what we found in the literature. But I will say that one thing we identified as a key gap in the literature is there's very limited information on cost of infrastructure. So you'll see a lot of the papers will focus on the benefits of infrastructure for wages, mobility, etc. But we rarely see cost-benefit analysis, and the reason is, there are no databases on except for one at the World Bank that we mentioned on road construction for their own contracts. But in general, it's hard to put these in a single database, and we hope in the future policymakers can help us gather better data on that. All right, so let me move on to hand over to Roman, who's going to talk to us a little bit about the conceptual framework that is used. So go ahead, Roman.
Okay, thank you, Marco. So I'm going to describe the different frameworks that the literature has developed to assess the impact of infrastructure. And the previous literature, the old literature, used a very simple seminal approach that goes on the time cost saving formula. And the main idea was to compare like the new transport options that you get from a road or from a railroad with the best alternative technology. And those were like what the old papers did by Fogel and by McFadden. So there is a famous paper by Fogel in which he evaluates the railways in the US. And he finds that with this methodology, at the aggregate level, the railways generate negligible effects. However, the literature has faced like two fundamental challenges when they want to evaluate infrastructure. The first challenge is about identification. So we know that usually infrastructure is not randomly placed. Sometimes it can go to places that are growing more than other places, or at times due to inequality concerns, it can go to places that are poor and can actually bias the coefficients the opposite way. And the second fundamental challenge is general equilibrium effect. So suppose that you build a road, or suppose that you build a metro in a city, you can think that economic agents are going to start making different decisions. So there is going to be a change, like, for example, in the trade flows that a region send to another regions. There is going to be a change in like the decision that workers make in terms of the place to work or the place to live. So this is going to generate spillovers to other regions. And we need to take that into account using general equilibrium frameworks. And very importantly, about these general equilibrium effects, there is this question where the infrastructure is just generating relocation so that people are just moving around in the economy, or is actually generating growth in the economy. And these general equilibrium models will help us to distinguish between the relocation effects and the growth effects. So I'm going to describe first the identification problem and then go to the general equilibrium model. So the identification problem is this thing that the infrastructure is not randomly allocated. And then what the literature has done is that they have used like something that in economics we call instruments, which is basically a variable that can explain the allocation of infrastructure today, but it is not correlated with supply or demand shocks today. So the literature has used like two different instruments. The first instrument is using like historical routes or historical cities. The main idea is that the infrastructure that the government is allocated today depends a lot on the roads that were like in previous centuries. And the literature has used this idea, especially in the case of Africa and in the case of Europe, to evaluate some of these infrastructure projects. Here is an example of Banerjee, Duflo, and Kian that is showing like the historical routes and the routes that are today to evaluate the infrastructure projects in China. So that's one of the instruments. The second instrument is called incidental connection, and it has the same idea. We want like some allocation of infrastructure that can explain the actual allocation of infrastructure, but is not correlated with amenity shocks or productivity shocks in some of these areas today. So the idea is usually when a government wants to allocate infrastructure, the government wants to connect like different cities or central locations such as cities or ports. And then based on geographical techniques, you can actually calculate what is like the least cost network that is going to minimize the cost, but is actually going to connect all these different central points. And that instrument is called the least cost path. So here you have an example from Faber 2014, in which the black lines correspond to the actual roads and the red lines correspond to the least cost path. And the idea is that these red lines are going to predict the allocation of the black lines, but these red lines are not going to be correlated with amenity or productivity shock. And there, you can also think that using these geographical techniques, you can also build like shortest route networks. So that with those two kind of instrument, we can solve the identification problem that the literature has found. Now, the second big challenge is more about the general equilibrium effects. So there are two ways in which the literature has tried to address this issue of potential spillover to other areas. The first one is like more like an empirical test. So the idea is just to do like donut estimators, in which you start removing like nearby areas. And the main assumption here is that usually the spillovers from an infrastructure project only goes to the locations that are close by to the locations that got exposed, directly exposed by the infrastructure. However, this is challenging if spillovers are not spatially concentrated. And it can be the case that there is a lot of trade between one location that is directly exposed and another location that is not directly exposed, and it is not close by to that location. And in particular, transportation networks are going to affect the economy at its aggregate level. So there are going to be changes in production output, there are going to be changes in prices, there are going to be changes in labor market outcomes, in wages, in trade and commuting shares, and that is always going to affect all the locations in the economy. It is not the fact that it is going to affect the locations that got directly exposed. So there are price and income effects in all locations, and the idea is how can we calculate those price and income effects that are driven by the infrastructure. So like the new economic geography models have been like borrowing elements from the trade literature, and now we have like very rich economic models that take into account the effects in all regions, and this is based on a large body of work by Allen and Arkolakis. There is this handbook by Renning and Rossi Hansberg that they show how to solve like the models. They show like the different methods to solve these general equilibrium models. And there are also this paper by Allen and Arkolakis that show like how can you actually invert the model and require like productivity and amenity parameters. And that is the case for interregional transportation, but you can also think that you can apply like similar frameworks to intra-city transportation. So there is this paper by Affelt et al. In 2015 that analyzes what is the impact of the removal of the Berlin Wall in Berlin. And what this paper does is that applies like the same framework, but instead of applying it to goods, it applies it to workers and to commuting flows. So it's applying gravity to commuting, but it borrows like the same elements from these economic geography models. And finally, one very important thing is that in these models, you can actually compute a measure that is called the market access measure. This market access measure is an exposure measure to the infrastructure, but it takes into account like what is going on like in other parts of the economy. And what the literature has shown, especially this paper by Donaldson and Horbeck, is that this market access measure works as a sufficient statistic to aggregate the impacts of the infrastructure via access to trade. So just with this market access measure, we can exactly know if the location benefited from the infrastructure or didn't benefit from the infrastructure. So now I'm handing it back to Marco, that he's going to describe the results from the interregional transportation literature.
Thanks so much, Roman. That was great. So now we go to the results. So we went over the landscape, we went over the methods, and so now we're going to discuss the results of this big literature. And we apologize for anyone we didn't fit in here. It was already pretty daunting, but we hope it's useful to give you a sense of where this team of people thought the more influential results were. So we split this in a way so that whatever you're working on or interested in, you can kind of directly jump to it. So we divide the results section into results in the literature from the effects of infrastructure connecting different places, so different cities or regions or ports to major cities. This we call interregional transport. And then Roman is going to discuss the results of transportation infrastructure within cities, so moving workers around. And in both cases, we separate between roads and rail results. Okay, so so let me discuss some of the really interesting work that has been done on rail first. And here it's interesting because it mixes up with history. So there's a lot of these studies on the effects of railroads in developing countries refer to railroads that were built during the colonial times. And so they are, in a way, very interesting because we can see the long-term effects, and you'll see that they show that they were positive and important. And on the other hand, you have to keep in mind that those railroads were geared towards resource extraction, right, for export to the colonizer. And less so to communicate between to basically connect different places within the country. So I'll start with the empirical evidence of positive impacts on GDP of railroads. So the two papers here is Jedwab and Moradi, and the Banerjee, Duflo, and Chan paper for China. And basically here they find somewhat different results of the railroads, but one thing that is a key takeaway for us in this literature is that it is important for papers that find these effects on growth of infrastructure to allow for mobility of factors, to allow for the movement of people, to take advantage of the more productive locations and capital to move to help productivity in these newly connected places. When that's less so, such as in China with the hukou, you tend to see lesser effects of those infrastructure. Now, one thing that we point out is that while these are exciting, these railroad effects, it is less clear that you would have similar impacts today, right? Because today you have other modes of transport that are dominant, such as trucks. So there's this big important paper from Donaldson 2018 on looking at the case of India and Indian railroads and through these general equilibrium trade models. And there, the evidence is quite strong that these railroad connections that the British built were really important for aggregate welfare. And similar papers using other identification strategies are mentioned here. So Fenske, Kala, and Wei, and Jedwab, Kirby, and Moradi for Kenya. All right, so that's on rail historical. Then there's this emerging literature on high-speed rail, mostly coming out of China, because that's where we are seeing a lot of these railroads being built in the developing world. And they're looking at really interesting aspects. These railroads, one should think, basically transport people, not goods. So in that sense, they're different. And they transport people very fast, but at a higher cost than other modes. And some of the emerging literature here suggests that it's being used to, it's valued by people who can avoid bouts of pollution and high temperature. So this is the Barwick et al. Paper. And then the Tian and Yu paper looks at what happens to firms as they have access to a high-speed rail. And it turns out labor productivity seems to increase due to further specialization of workers. So that is from the railroad. Let me jump over quickly to the highways literature in developing countries, connecting regions. And here, again, we find pretty compelling evidence that this has important effects. And here I mentioned some of the papers. So this is the paper by Favor that Roman mentioned for China, Jedwab and Storygard for African countries. And what we tend to find is not a homogeneous effects of having access to highways on welfare and incomes, but rather that highways allow regions to specialize in their comparative advantage. So what you tend to see is that larger cities, more industrialized cities, when they get access to improved road transportation, they grow more, they become more industrialized. When more rural parts of a country get highways, you do tend to see that they become more specialized in agriculture, less so in manufacturing. So they specialize in their comparative advantage, but there's less clear income effects for the regions that are agricultural at baseline. But broadly, the message here is that railroads allow different regions to specialize in their comparative advantage and improve well-being in these different regions. So it's a set of papers where instead of connecting peripheries to port, such as these ones, you have connecting regions to each other. So review those, and in here the messages are broadly similar. So you have some, not a homogeneous positive effect. You can have heterogeneous effects of roads, and initial conditions matter for these effects. So I know we're running a little bit low on time, so I will mention that there is an emerging literature here thinking about the dynamic effects of roads. So what happens to highways as you build them and what dynamic impacts they have. And this has been a theme of where we see future work going. So for example, a good example of this is the Balboni paper looking at Vietnam. And so she looks at roads in Vietnam and she says, they've been built with a coastal bias. So more than you would have expected, given some optimal placement, like to maximize market access. And furthermore, if you think about these places are going to be flooded in a few decades, then those investments make less sense today. So that's kind of an interesting line of work that we're seeing more of. And so I'll just mention out that in terms of the optimal placement literature and dynamic effects, these roads, like these paper like Bonfatti and Polgheke, highlight that in Africa, a lot of the infrastructure was built for resource extraction and less to connect different locations within a country or to neighbors. And this has really changed the patterns of trade that we see in Africa, much more trading with the rest of the world and less so between African countries and African regions. So, and finally, in this section on infrastructure connecting different locations, there's a big and interesting literature on rural road effects. And here, what the message that emerges is that getting connections to rural areas doesn't seem to have transformative effects on incomes, but it does allow the reallocation of workers. So you tend to see effects where, especially if they're close to cities, that if these more rural places get connected, then you see workers more likely to move out of agriculture and into non-agricultural occupations. And so here the effects have been a little bit underwhelming, although there are exceptions. So the message here is mixed. So here's an exception, like the Brooks and Donovan paper on river bridges in Nicaragua, or a work of mine with co-authors with Paul Gertler on regional highways in Indonesia. So let me save this to the end and the areas for future work. I've kind of already mentioned, but well, let me highlight two: the effects of climate risk interacting with infrastructure. Second is more and more work is emerging, but there's still very little on the interaction between infrastructure and environmental externalities. So that's kind of going to become even more important in the future. So let me hand it over to Roman, who's going to discuss the intra-city transportation literature results.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about intra-city transportation. So there is like a large, so what we are going to divide this section into two subsections. The first section is going to talk about what is the impact of highways, subways, buses, and BRT. And then the second section is going to be more about like what is the impact of railways and metros in these kind of cities. And in principle, intra-city transportation shares a very similar framework to interregional transportation. Instead of applying gravity to trade flows, in the case of intra-city transportation, we're applying gravity to commuting flows. And in the same way that it can generate general equilibrium effects across regions, it can generate general equilibrium effects across locations within a city. However, there are like two main key differences between intra-city transportation and interregional transportation. The first difference is that, of course, transit is going to especially move people. So it is not going to move goods. It is going to move people, and we care more about people than goods. And the second main key difference is that transit options can also affect or address more externalities in the case of intra-city transportation than inter-regional transportation. So there are like more externalities in cities. You can have congestions, you can have crime, you can have accidents. So we also need to take care, we also need to take into account those externalities when evaluating the benefits of intra-city transportation. So the literature in the US has shown that infrastructure promotes sprawl in the sense that it promotes suburbanization. So people move out of cities and go like to the suburbs to live. There is some evidence in developing countries about that. This paper by Bloom uses like the data of Chinese lending in different parts of the world and find some of these effects of sprawling, but it is much lower, to a much lower extent than what the literature in the US has found so far. And what the literature has found is that connecting commuters to jobs can actually lead to very higher gains, and it is more substantial than the ones that you get with the cost time saving approach. So, for example, this paper by Nick Sivanidis evaluates the largest BRT in the world, which is the BRT in Bogota, and it shows that increased like commuter market access and fair market access. And when you take into account all the general equilibrium effects that come from the BRT, the gains are much higher. And similarly, this paper by Marco and Quintana Domenech that evaluates a road paving program in Veracruz, Mexico, shows that residents that experience the benefits from the road paving actually gain a lot in terms of property values. Now, what it is common in the developing world is that the total use of public transit decreases with income. So in principle, you may think that some of these transit interventions are going to reduce inequality and are going to be pro-poor. But like what the literature has shown is that when we take into account the general equilibrium effects, that is not the case. So the transit investment may not be pro-poor because people relocate across the city, and it turns out that high-income people are moving to the locations that are experiencing the larger gains. So in that sense, relocation effects matter. So there is the same paper by Nick Sivanidis actually find these relocation effects that mitigate the effects on the poor, and the paper by Claire Balboni, Melody Morden, and Garrett Bryan also find something similar in Dar es Salaam. Now, like as I mentioned before, like we also care about externalities in this context. So we also care about congestion. So people have been working to document like the differences in speed between low-income countries and more developed countries. And what the literature has shown is that developing country cities have very lower speed. So this paper by Protoy Akbar and co-authors shows that speeds in high-income countries are like more 50% faster than the ones in low-income countries. But it does not only to be with congestion, it also has to be related to the quality of infrastructure. So as Marco showed you at the beginning, speed are slower even at uncongested time. So that's the other paper by Protoy Akbar and co-authors. Now, one striking result is in this literature is that congestion taxes can actually be very ineffective because the elasticity with respect to congestion is very low. So actually, this paper by Gabriel Krenler, he basically randomized and give commuters options to go and travel in different times of the day. But it turns out that people actually like to leave their home at 8 a.m. or 9 a.m. So they are very unresponsive to these tax incentives. And similarly, this paper by Protoy Akbar and Gilles Duranton tries to estimate like what is the elasticity of vehicles with respect to congestion. And they find like very low elasticities, which suggests that congestion is not a very important problem, or at least that people are not willing to reduce congestion in terms of like the time at which they are traveling. Now, There is less available evidence on other congestion policies. So there are like some papers that have looked at high occupancy vehicle lanes, and this can actually mitigate delays in Jakarta. So this paper by Rima Hane and Gabriel Kalender and Ben Olken actually estimate the effect of a policy in Jakarta that close some of these high occupancy vehicle lanes, and they find like very important effect. And this paper by Protoy Akbar and co-authors think that actually one policy that can generate faster speed is to address encroachment in developing countries, which seems as a very big problem. Now, there are other externalities that can come from transportation infrastructure within cities, and that can be more externalities rather than gas congestion. So there can be like externalities about pollution, there can be externalities about accidents, and externalities about noise. Of course, these externalities impose very high cost for welfare, but first, it is very difficult to measure this externality. And second, if it is difficult to measure them, it is even more difficult to design instruments that replicate Pigouvian taxes and can address these externalities. So regulating these externalities is very challenging, and we still know very little on how to design some of these policies, but we already have some insights from the literature. So this paper by Davis and this paper by Paulina Oliva actually show that in developing countries, the vehicles are older, so they generate more of these externalities. So one potential option is basically to remove all these older vehicles and bring new vehicles to reduce the potential externalities from environmental aspects. And another important paper is this paper by Habyarimana and William, in which they message about accidents in Kenyan minibuses, and this is an effective policy to reduce the accidents of minibuses. Now, there is a big question in terms of policy, which is what is the right amount of public transportation and where should we allocate the infrastructure. So there is this trade-off between the frequency of service and the more extensive network. And the evidence from the literature has shown that we should actually increase the amount of public transportation. So I'm just going to focus on this paper by Gabriel Krenler that estimate what is the optimal BRT network in Jakarta. And what they show is that it should be less concentrated in the center, and it should be more expensive towards the outskirts part of the city in Jakarta. Now, there are like several important questions to study in terms of informal transportation modes, and also in terms of the motorization of the city. Now, I'm going to go very quickly about the effect of subways, light rails, and cable cars. The literature has shown that this can generate very important effects. So Marco has a paper with Matt Turner in which they show that it can actually cause some of this decentralization, but to a lower extent than what the roads produce in the US. My own work has shown that metros in Mexico City can actually incentivize formal employment. There is also some work in Medellin in which they have shown that some of these externalities can actually be reduced. So in particular, crime can be reduced. And like this paper by Coley and Xu also shows that metros can actually generate collaboration and can lead to more innovation. And also that subway expansions can actually improve air quality and improve health outcomes. But one important parameter in there is how easy it is for commuters to substitute across like different transportation modes, like to substitute between cars and substitute towards metros and towards subways. Yeah, so I think that Marco is going to wrap up everything and talk about the general overview and areas for future research.
Yes, thank you so much. So we only have a minute or so, but we wanted to first say we hope you enjoyed the review of the the landscape, the methods, and the results broken up by across regions within cities, and the types of things that people are the results that we've been getting in the last few years. in terms of roads and railroads for cities. So it's exciting times for this literature for infrastructure in developing countries. As you know, there's a huge urbanization process going on in Asia and Africa and throughout the developing world. So in a way, these issues are going to become even more important in the future. And so we expect to see further work here using new data, some from satellite, cell phone, Google Maps. All of these kind of data sources are coming online, and we're learning a lot more about what kind of policies to implement in developing countries. We hope these results are useful to the policymakers and to students who want to jump into this literature. We're happy to take on questions now. And that's it. Thank you, Oliver.
Thanks so much, Marco and Roman. That was brilliant. So I guess the first question that I'll pose from Andy, who asks whether it's possible to use the kind of general equilibrium models that you talk about beforehand to kind of analyze the potential effects of expanding infrastructure rather than kind of looking at stuff after it's happened. Because I guess that must be probably more useful for a policymaker if they're trying to.
Yeah, so that's definitely possible, and it's part of the work that like people at the World Bank here in the transportation unit are doing. So the main idea is to apply like some of these general equilibrium models to understand what is the effect of future roads and future improvements that the government want to implement. So that is definitely possible. I think that something that it is important is that, of course, like the parameters that you are going to put into the model depend on the context that in which you are evaluating some of this infrastructure. So it is always good to, to simulate these policies with different parameters. But saying that, yes, that's definitely something that policymakers can do. I think, and I have discussed a bit this with Nick Sivanis, it is more about like ranking like the different infrastructure projects, more like what is going to be like the aggregate impact or the exact aggregate impact of this infrastructure project. But saying that, I'm working with the IGC and with the other Oliver Harman, in developing a toolkit so that policymakers can actually use to simulate some of these policy. And that is some work like that we're doing with the IGC. Nick Sivanis is also involved in that project, and we hope to release that toolkit soon.
Yeah, if I can just add, Oliver, to that answer, is that exactly this purpose of doing ex-ante evaluation is a very nice feature of these comprehensive general equilibrium models, and they are useful to think about comparing what the optimal network would look like and what has been built. So to compare not just ex post evaluation, but ex ante, and where to play new infrastructure. I think that's where they're especially useful. And there's new developments there on the total amount of infrastructure that could be built and where to locate it. So I think they're quite useful for guiding those processes.
There's an interesting question here from Henry Telly, who asks about kind of looking historically, which lots of the papers that are covered in this review do, more about how countries that at the time were building up their kind of railway networks and were at the time themselves kind of developing or in the earlier stages of development, how they were able to afford these investments, and if there's any kind of lessons that we can draw for countries now that are at similar points to maybe somewhere like the US that now has this big transport network.
Right. Maybe, I guess I don't have a complete answer, but I would say it was in my mind an advantage of the colonizer that had more developed capital markets, where they raised, we know of many instances where they raised money in capital markets in the home country to build all of these infrastructures. And so they were paid off through the resource extraction that happened later, right? But you do see the important role of low inflation, access to capital markets for infrastructure investments. That would be my takeaway for today. It's that all of this can happen as long as the relevant actors, either the private sector, but more importantly, the local government has access to international markets that can provide these funds. That would be my answer, Roman.
Yeah, I have the same answer, Marco. I think that it was more about like the colonization process and which were like the colonizers. Of course, like colonization, let's say that they wanted to exploit some of these natural resources, and in order to exploit these natural resources, they needed to export these natural resources. So they needed ports, and because they needed ports, they were the ones who built like most of this infrastructure. Like and the literature has exploited that idea. Like if you look at at some of the papers by Remy Gedwab, he actually exploits that colonization process to evaluate like what is the effect of roads and what is the effect of railways.
Right. There's another question by Marta who asks whether papers have kind of looked at or measured how improving the quality and I guess also the quantity of roads, what impact that has on the car accident rate. So I guess, is there any evidence that better quality roads lead to less accidents? And is that something that's kind of incorporated into the benefits of improving infrastructure?
I would say, maybe correct me if I'm wrong, Roman, but I feel like there isn't much there because there's there's a data issue, right? That a lot of these accidents don't get captured in data sets that we can analyze. But I would say that there is, I think, a sense that this is a really important effect of higher quality infrastructure. I have seen some papers for developed countries looking at the effects of reducing like speeds and what that does to accident rates. So, and there's that paper on the informal transit in was it in Kenya, where they gave messages to the passengers, hey, you can speak up. The speed limit is this. And so they found positive effects there. So I think there's a lot of work to be done there, but that's basically an open field at this point. And I think that we would find important effects because, saving a life is worth so much.
Yeah, so like I have the same thoughts as Marco. I don't think that there is much about like what is the impact of the quality of infrastructure on car accidents. So it is a future area of research, and like something that it is important is that usually like when we evaluate infrastructure, we do not take into account like some of these effects. So it's not only about like estimating the effect, it's also about like quantifying some of these effects that roads can have on the life of people.
Thanks. We have a question here from Jenna who asks about the breakdown of current lending. So there was that figure at the start of the presentation about the 33 billion from the World Bank. And I guess there's lots of funding coming from other places as well. Do we have a sense about how that breaks down in terms of rail, roads, but also I guess inter-regional transport versus kind of intercity or intra-city transport networks?
Roman, do you know more about that?
No, I mean that's a very important question. I think that my sense is that it is also an area to study. So I know that there are some papers about procurement and how governments can finance some of this infrastructure, but it's like we do not know much about how to finance some of these projects in developing economies. That's my sense, but and that's what we found like when we were doing the review. But I don't know if you have a different feeling, Marco.
Well, I guess I was thinking Jenna's point was more about how does the World Bank portfolio allocate across these types of investments right now. So, but I don't know. I don't have a
Okay.
good sense, but that data must be available at the World Bank, like where their portfolios is
Yeah,
geared towards.
that data is available. Yeah, and I don't know, but I can ask here around to see
Yeah.
how they decide about which projects to allocate, and yeah, but yeah, I do not have a good answer for that.
Yeah. But a lot of times it plays an important role, like World Bank lending and the other international organizations lending for kickstarting some of these projects. I know they were behind the BRT in Mexico City, etc. So sometimes they do provide the advice and some of the financing for these projects to take place. Yeah.
Yeah, one thing that I know that China is like now lending a lot of money to these countries, and some of the requirements are much lower than what the World Bank actually asked to. So like evaluating some of these projects can be useful. Yeah.
Mhm.
Great. Thank you both so much for the presentation and also for answering those questions. I think we have to wrap up there. I can see there's some questions we didn't get around to, but they will be automatically recorded, and then I can send them over to Marco and Roman, who will be able to see them and maybe get back to them if there's something in there that they have a strong opinion on. I've put a link in the chat to where you can download this VoxDevLit on the VoxDev website. So be sure to go and check out the full piece after this event. We're really excited that next year we'll be launching a number of new VoxDevLits on kind of search and labour markets, on foreign direct investment, on female labour force participation, and a whole range of other things. And one of the benefits of this type of resource is that over time they're also going to be kept up to date. So approximately once a year, the senior editors and the co-editors kind of see what new research has been done and add that to the VoxDevLit so that it stays relevant and kind of doesn't grow outdated over time. Thanks again, Roman and Marco.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for the
Oliver.
initiative, and thanks for
Yeah.
that's to the VoxDev and CPR.
Yeah, thank you
Great.
for the initiative, Oliver. I think that it is a very useful resource for policymakers and students. Thank you.